In America, we're taught to think of the U.S. Constitution as something almost sacred. It's this perfect blueprint for democracy, the bedrock of the entire nation. Or is it?
What if that's not the whole story? What if the document we hold in such high regard is actually, well, deeply flawed?
Well, that's exactly the argument that historian Ferdinand Lundberg makes. He suggests that this sacred document isn't a masterpiece at all, but is actually riddled with cracks right from the very beginning. So, to really understand these so-called cracks, we have to start with the architects themselves, the framers. And according to Lundberg, the popular image we have of them, that's the first big myth we need to bust.
We're taught to see the founders as these noble, enlightened philosophers, right? But Lundberg, he paints a totally different picture. He calls them wealthy, self-interested wheeler dealers who are way more focused on protecting their own bank accounts.
I mean, just look at who was actually there. The 55 delegates at the convention weren't just deep thinkers. They were planters, bankers, merchants, even slave traders. Lundberg argues their number one goal wasn't creating a government for everybody, but one that protected their own money and property. He flat out called it a gathering of the rich, the well-born.
Okay, so maybe they were a bit self-interested, but you'd think they'd at least be proud of the document they created, wouldn't you? Well, here's where the story gets really surprising.
Take Alexander Hamilton. He was one of the Constitution's biggest champions. But behind the scenes, he called it a shilly-shally thing of mere milk and water, a frail and worthless document. Wow, not exactly a ringing endorsement.
And get this, even James Madison, the guy literally called the father of the Constitution, admitted it was not a faultless work. He actually got so fed up with how the government was using it that he did a complete 180 on his politics and spent the rest of his life arguing against the very system he helped create.
And maybe the most chilling take came from Benjamin Franklin. He predicted the whole thing would eventually end in despotism. But that brings up a really important question. When he mentioned the people, who exactly did he mean?
And that question about the people takes us right to the front door of the Constitution itself, the famous preamble and its powerful opening line.
We the people. It's maybe the three most famous words in American history. It gives you this feeling that everyone had a say, that the entire nation came together to build this new government. But, according to Lundberg, that iconic phrase is the sole myth in the entire document. He says the people actually had nothing to do with it, and that those words were just, well, meaningless window dressing. The hard reality, he says, comes down to this single number, 12.5%. That's the tiny slice of the population, and we're talking only white, male property owners who were even allowed to vote on approving the Constitution. So, let that sink in. The vast majority of the country, almost 88% of the people, had zero voice. We're talking all women, all enslaved people, all indigenous people, and even white men who didn't own property. They were completely shut out of the decision.
So all of this leads Lundberg to a pretty stark conclusion. That whole idea of a government by the people, in his view, it's a fantasy. The reality, he writes, is simple. The people are governed.
Okay, so if the people are just being governed, what about the government itself? This gets us to another core American belief, that the Constitution was all about limiting power. The story we all learn in school is that the framers were terrified of tyranny, so they built this government of limited powers with all sorts of clever checks and balances to keep it under control. But Lundberg, he flips that whole idea on its head. He says the document didn't restrain the government at all. In fact, he claims it created what he calls a veiled autocrat, a president with nearly unlimited power, almost like a king.
So where does this huge power come from? Lundberg points to one short, kind of vague sentence in Article 2. The executive power shall be vested in a president. He argues that phrase is a blank check, basically giving the president the authority to do whatever they think is necessary.
And you can see this power everywhere. As commander-in-chief, the president can basically go to war. They can make treaties with other countries all on their own. Their veto power can stop new laws cold. And with executive orders, they can pretty much write new laws all by themselves.
So after picking apart who the framers were, the whole idea of we the people, and the power of the president, what's Lundberger's final verdict on America's founding document? Well, he definitely doesn't pull any punches. He says that when you measure the Constitution against what most Americans hoped it would be, it has been, quite plainly, a huge flop. So let's just quickly recap Lundberg's big critiques.
He argues the Constitution was cooked up by a self-interested elite. It almost completely shut the people out of the process. He says it totally failed to limit government power, and instead, it created a presidency that's just way too powerful.
And all of this leaves us with a really big question. Is the Constitution that timeless, perfect guide we've always been told it is? Or could Ferdinand Lundberg be right? Is it a flawed document from a very different time, one that's way overdue for a serious, critical second look?